While we are sitting here doing this interview, the terrorist organization ISIS and even al-Nusra is overrunning Al Yarmouk refugee camp. At the same time, al-Nusra is controlling the Syrian-Jordanian border and has taken control over Idlib. How serious would you describe the situation now?
It's more dangerous this time because we don't have international law, and you don't have the international, the effective or the active or effective international organization that would protect a country from another countries who use the terrorists as a proxy to destroy another country. That's what's happening in Syria.
The United Nations Syria envoy, Mr. Staffan de Mistura, is planning a series of consultations to begin in May or June to assess the chance of finding common ground between the main states with an interest in the conflict. What do you think about it?
Actually, I agree with the Mistura about this point, because if we want to look at the conflict in Syria as only internal conflict between Syrian factions, that's not realistic and that's not objective. Actually, the problem is not very complicated, but it became complicated because of the external intervention. And any plan, if you want to execute in Syria today in order to solve the problem, and that's what he faced in his plan toward Aleppo, it will be spoiled by external intervention. That's what happened in Aleppo when the Turks told their the faction that the terrorists that they support and they supervise to refuse to cooperate with the Mistura. So I think he's aware that without bringing those countries, if he couldn't convince those countries to stop supporting the terrorists and let the Syrians solve their problem, he will not succeed.
Mr. President, Sweden is the only country in Europe that grants permanent rights of stay for people that flee the war in Syria. What has that meant, and how do you view Sweden's policy?
I think that's something appreciated around the world, not only in our country. And that's, I mean, this humanitarian stand of Sweden is appreciated regarding different conflicts, including the Syrian one. So this is a good thing to do, to give people refuge. But if you ask the Syrian people who fled from Syria, what do you want? They don't want to flee Syria because of the war. They want to end that war. That's their aim. That's our aim. So I think if you help people, if you give people refuge, is good. But the best is to help them going back to their country. How? I think Sweden is an important country in the EU. It can play a major role in lifting the sanction.
Embargo and war and millions of refugees or people who fled from the country. This has been described as the worst refugee crisis since World War II. How big responsibility, Mr. President, do you have for this situation?
I think to compare between what's happening in Syria, even from a humanitarian point of view, and what happened in the World War II, I think it's kind of a huge exaggeration. We cannot compare for political reasons.
According to SAPO, the Swedish intelligence agency, returning jihadists, there are many here in Syria now, returning jihadists are the biggest domestic threat in Sweden today. Do you agree?
I wouldn't look at the terrorism as domestic and as regional. It's, as I said, it's global. So and if you want to look at Sweden as part of Europe or part of the Scandinavian group of European countries, you have to take into consideration that the most dangerous leaders of Daesh or ISIS in our region are Scandinavian. Yeah.
It's information?
Yeah, it's information. That's what we have as information. So you cannot separate this group of countries or Sweden from Europe. As long as you have terrorism growing in different European countries, Sweden cannot be safe. As long as the backyard of Europe, especially the Mediterranean and Northern Africa, is in chaos and full of terrorists, Europe cannot be safe.
Have Sweden asked you to share information about these ISIS fighters or other jihadists?
No, there's no contact between our intelligence agencies and the Swedish.
Mr. President, December 2010, Taimur Abdulwahab, a Swedish terrorist who was trained in Iraq and Syria, carried out a suicide attack in Stockholm. Recently, the same scenario in Paris, Charlie Hebdo, and even Copenhagen. Do you think Western countries will face the same scenario in the future?
Terrorism is a huge mountain. It's not isolated event. When you have those isolated events, you have to know that you have a big mountain under the sea that you don't see. So yes, I expect, as long as we have this mountain, and as long as many European officials still adulating countries like Saudi Arabia and Qatar just for their money and selling their values, and allow the Wahhabi dark ideology to infiltrate it and instilled some communities in Europe, we have to expect more attacks in that regard.